The hum of the jet engines was steady, but the tension in the cabin was not. Somewhere in the front row of the first-class section, a baby's cry tore through the air, sharp, unrelenting, and uncomfortably human in a space built for silence and status. Passengers shifted in their leather seats, eyes rolled. A man in an expensive suit sighed loudly, making sure his irritation was a performance. The mother, young, elegant, and visibly wealthy, rocked the child desperately. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she tried to shush him, but the wailing only grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't the usual tired whimper. It was the cry of a child whose world had cracked open. Flight attendants whispered, a few offered help, but the woman shook her head, polite, controlled, unwilling to appear needy. She didn't notice the way some passengers were already constructing their judgments about her parenting, her privilege, her inability to manage her own child. 5 rows back, in economy, sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 15. Dark skin, scuffed sneakers, clothes that told stories of hand-me-downs and stretching every dollar. He was quiet, watching. His seatmate, an older woman with warm eyes, noticed his gaze. And here's where the moment begins to bend. Because that boy, who had no wealth, no ticket to first class, no visible reason to be noticed, would in less than 5 minutes, do something that would change the entire mood of that cabin. Something no one expected, something that would leave even the millionaire mother speechless. But we're not there yet. Right now, all we have is a crying baby, a frustrated plane full of strangers, and an invisible line between wealth and poverty, silence and compassion. And here sits the question I want you to hold. What does it take for a person who has nothing to step into a moment and give more than anyone else could imagine? Because a single action, quiet, unannounced, is about to flip the entire outcome. Before we understand what the boy did, we need to understand why he could do it. Because moments like these are never accidents, they're the sum of 1,000 small experiences, quiet battles, and lessons that rarely make headlines. His name was Malik. 15 years old, born and raised in a neighborhood where the sound of sirens at night was more common than the sound of bedtime stories. He lived with his grandmother, Miss Laverne, a retired nurse who carried herself like she still wore the uniform. She taught him early that survival wasn't just about having enough. It was about knowing enough, about reading a room before you spoke, and reading a person before you judged them. From the time Malik was 6, she made him help with her volunteer work at the community center, stocking food shelves, folding donated clothes, sitting with children who were too anxious or too restless to stay still. It was there that he learned the rhythm of a distressed child, the way their breathing changes before the tears start, the subtle shift in their eyes when fear replaces discomfort. Miss Laverne called it listening beyond the noise. It ain't set the crying you sit trying to stop, baby, she told him once while rocking a toddler who had been separated from his mother. It sets the fear underneath it. Find that, and you find your way to them. But Malik's lessons didn't stop at compassion. He'd also learned the weight of being underestimated. In school, some teachers treated him like his future was a statistic, not a choice. Store clerks followed him as if his hands were magnets for what wasn't his. He learned how quickly people made assumptions about his intelligence, his worth, his potential, without knowing a thing about him. That does something to you. It sharpens you. It teaches you to see the cracks in people's armor, the moments when they're exposed, not to exploit them, but to decide who you want to be when the moment calls you forward. So when Malik heard the baby's cry on that plane, he didn't just hear noise. He heard a pattern, a sharp intake, a sob, a tiny pause, like the child was fighting to catch his breath but couldn't. He recognized it. He'd heard it before in the shelter, in the waiting room at the free clinic. And here sits the root cause of everything that's about to happen. Malik wasn't thinking about himself, or the invisible barrier between economy and first class. He was thinking about the child, and the fear beneath the sound. He didn't know it yet, but every hardship, every act of care he'd witnessed, every time he'd been forced to read a situation faster than anyone else, it had prepared him for this exact moment. The question was, would he act? Because stepping forward meant crossing more than just a physical aisle. It meant crossing into a space where people like him were often told, in words or in looks, you don't belong here. And that's the moral fork in the road we're about to reach. The crying hadn't stopped. If anything, it had sharpened, cutting through the cabin like a blade. The millionaire mother's polished calm was fraying. She adjusted her baby's blanket, whispered soothing nonsense, bounced him in a rhythm that only seemed to make him more frantic. The diamond bracelet on her wrist clinked softly with each motion, but the sound was drowned out by the relentless wail. In the row across from her, a businessman in a charcoal suit muttered something about people traveling with kids. A woman 2 rows back pressed the flight attendant button with the impatience of someone accustomed to immediate service. Malik could feel it, the room's temperature shifting. This wasn't just a baby crying anymore. it was a social test. The kind of test that reveals who's willing to help, and who's quick to judge. And in that moment, Malik knew he had three choices. Do nothing, stay in his seat, keep his head down, and let the moment pass like everyone else. After all, it wasn't his problem. Judge silently. Join the chorus of people who believed the mother was failing. It would cost him nothing to side with the majority. Act. Step into a space where no one expected him to have the answer. A space where some might even resent his presence, and try to do something about it. Here sits the thing about these choices. Most people pick the first or second, not because they're cruel, but because stepping into a problem you didn't cause comes with risk. You might fail, you might embarrass yourself, you might make it worse. And Malik felt all of that risk pressing against him like a wall. He could see the imaginary headlines in their eyes. Unruly teen interferes, distracts flight crew, makes a scene. But he could also hear Miss Lavernsteth's voice in his head. Baby, the moments that matter most will never feel safe. If it feels safe, it probably ain't sit worth doing. He looked toward the first-class cabin again. The baby's cries came in ragged bursts now, almost hoarse. Malik recognized that sound, the moment before exhaustion, when a child's body starts to give up even as the fear inside them is still roaring. And that sets when it hit him. This wasn't set about him being right or wrong. It was about whether the child could keep breathing without choking on his own sobs. He unbuckled his seatbelt, slowly, quietly. The woman sitting next to him raised an eyebrow. Where you going? She whispered. Malik didn't said answer. Because in that instant, the decision had already been made. He was going to cross that aisle. He was going to step into a world that didn't expect him, maybe didn't even want him, and see if he could reach the child. He didn't set no if they set to let him. He didn't set no if the mother would trust him. But he did know this. A single action could flip the entire outcome. And he was about to find out if he was the one to take it. The aisle felt longer than it was. Every step Malik took toward first class carried the weight of invisible eyes, the curious, the skeptical, the annoyed. It wasn't just about where he was walking, it was about who was walking there. Halfway up, a flight attendant stepped forward, polite but firm. Sir, can I help you with something? She asked, her body angled to block his path without seeming obvious. Malik glanced toward the baby, still crying, now in short, strained bursts, then back at her. I think I can help, he said simply. The attendant hesitated. He didn't look like a threat, but he didn't look like someone with a reason to be in first class either. She opened her mouth to politely decline, but the mother, perhaps out of sheer desperation, spoke first. Let him through, she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd been holding on too long. Malik stepped forward and knelt beside her seat. He didn't rush. He didn't make eye contact with the other passengers. Didn't try to explain himself. He simply extended his hands, palms open, non-threatening. May I? He asked. The mother studied him for a moment. And here's where Malik's hidden power began to work. A power that had nothing to do with money, position, or status.
It was presence.
Not the loud kind that demands attention. The quiet kind that earns trust. The kind forged in 100 rooms where he'd had to calm frightened toddlers, coax anxious kids out of hiding, or steady his own breath so someone else could steady theirs. When the mother handed over the baby, Malik didn't start with rocking or bouncing. Instead, he did something small, almost invisible. He pressed the baby gently against his chest, resting his chin lightly on the child's head, and began to hum. It wasn't a song from the radio, or anything polished. It was the kind of hum that exists only between a caregiver and a child, low, steady, vibrating through the bones more than the ears. The baby's cries didn't stop immediately, but something changed. The pitch softened, the breaths between sobs lengthened. Malik shifted his weight slightly, swaying just enough to match the rhythm of the hum. He was doing exactly what Miss Laverne had taught him. Listen beyond the noise. Match their rhythm first, then guide it toward calm. What Malik understood, and what no one else on that plane could see yet, was that distressed infants often need regulated breathing and vibration, more than verbal comfort. Research shows that when a caregiver holds a child close and provides a steady rhythm, through heartbeat, hum, or gentle motion, the child's nervous system begins to mirror it. Heart rate slows, breathing evens, panic fades. This wasn't an accident. This was skill. The kind you don't get from privilege, you get from practice. The baby Sep's cries began to taper off. Passengers who had been side-eyeing him now found themselves leaning forward, watching the impossible happen in real time. But Malik wasn't thinking about the audience. He was thinking about the boy in his arms, the way his tiny fingers had unclenched from their fists, the way his breathing had finally settled into Malik's own. And for the first time since the plane had taken off, the cabin was quiet. What Malik didn't nut yet was that his quiet victory was about to collide with something much bigger, a force determined to put him back in his place. The silence was fragile. Like a thin sheet of glass laid over the cabin, everyone careful not to move too quickly, lest it shatter again. Malik kept humming, his sway barely perceptible, the baby now limp against his chest in the way only deeply calmed infants can be. The mother's shoulders finally loosened, her hands resting in her lap for the first time since takeoff. But peace in spaces like this is often short-lived. The businessman in the charcoal suit, the same one who had been muttering earlier, leaned forward and said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. So, anyone can just stroll up here now. The words weren't directed at Malik so much as they were meant to draw a line in the sand. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. He doesn't belong here. A second later, the flight attendant, who had stopped Malik earlier, reappeared. She wasn't unkind, but there was tension in her voice. Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your seat now. You stir not permitted to remain in first class. The mother turned sharply. He just got my son to stop crying, she said, her tone sharper than before. Why would you? Mesepim, it's Sepim's policy, the attendant interrupted. We have to maintain the seating arrangement for safety, and for the comfort of all passengers. Comfort. The word hit Malik harder than it should have. He knew what it meant here, not the baby's comfort, not the mother's, but the comfort of those who had paid for the quiet, for the separation. He could feel every eye on him again, some apologetic, some cold, some calculating whether this was about rules or something else entirely. And here's the thing, this wasn't the first time Malik had seen a good thing get swallowed up by the wrong kind of authority. In school, he'd once stopped a fight before it turned ugly, only to be scolded for getting involved. In the corner store, he'd carried groceries for an elderly neighbor, only to be followed outside by a clerk who assumed he'd stolen something. It was a familiar pattern. Do something right. Get treated like you've done something wrong. The mother Stet's voice broke the silence. "He sits staying until we land," she said firmly. "If there sits a problem, I sits like to speak to whoever sits in charge." The attendant hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the optics of removing the boy who sit just saved everyone from another 2 hours of wailing. She finally sighed. "Fine, but just until we begin our descent." Malik said nothing. He just kept humming, his eyes fixed on the sleeping child. But inside something had shifted. This wasn't just about a baby anymore. It was about the quiet truth that no matter how much value you bring, there will always be spaces that try to push you back to where they think you belong. And Malik knew, even if he didn't plan on it yet, that this flight wasn't going to end the way they expected. The baby was still asleep, his small head pressed against Malik's collarbone. First class had fallen into a strange kind of stillness, not the stiff, curated quiet it had before, but something looser, more human. People weren't hiding behind newspapers or screens anymore. They were watching him, and not just because of the baby. The mother leaned closer. Her voice was low enough that only Malik could hear. "You have a gift?" she said. "Do you do this for work?" Malik shook his head. "Just learned it from my grandma." Something softened in her expression, a recognition maybe, that skill and wisdom aren't always framed in diplomas or resumes. But Malik could still feel the earlier tension in the air, the businessman's muttered comment, the flight attendant's reluctance. Even with the proof of the baby's calm right in front of them, certain people still seemed unsettled by him being there. And that sits when the thought hit him. This wasn't just a one-off act of kindness, this was a mirror. It was showing people something about themselves, about the way they assigned value, about who they believed could contribute in certain spaces. He remembered something Miss Laverne used to tell him, whenever they walked past the high-end shops downtown. "Baby, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay exactly where they think you can sit." That line replayed in his head like a slow drumbeat. If he returned to his seat quietly now, the story for most of these passengers would be a poor kid helped for a minute, then went back where he belonged. But if he stayed visible, calm, competent, undeniable, he could rewrite it. He could leave them with a different memory. A boy from the back of the plane didn't just belong here. He made this space better. It wasn't stick ego, it was strategy. Because Malik understood that moments like this don't come often, and when they do, they can plant seeds that grow in ways you never see. So he adjusted the baby slightly, making sure the child was comfortable, then sat back, fully in the seat beside the mother, as if it had been his from the start. He didn't fidget, didn't make himself small. He simply occupied the space with the quiet authority of someone who had earned it. This was no longer about the crying baby. It was about how long he could hold the truth in front of them without flinching, that competence and compassion don't come with a boarding pass price. And he didn't know it yet, but the real test was still ahead. Because before this flight landed, someone was going to force a choice. one that would make the earlier tension look like a warm-up. Malik didn't need to make a speech. In fact, he knew that saying too much could make people dig in their heels. What he needed was to be seen, doing the thing no one else on that plane could have done. So he kept working his quiet strategy. Every few minutes, the baby would stir, whimpering on the edge of waking. Malik responded instantly, not with frantic shushing, but with the same slow hum, the same steady sway, his breathing deep and even. Each time the baby melted back into sleep within seconds. The mother, still watching him like she was piecing together a puzzle, began asking him small questions, where he was headed. If he'd ever thought about working with children, Malik answered simply, without apology for who he was or where he came from. Around them, the cabin's atmosphere kept shifting. The businessman who'd complained earlier no longer leaned away, now he was glancing over with something that looked suspiciously like curiosity. The woman across the aisle asked if Malik had any siblings. Even the flight attendant, still cautious, stopped by once to offer him water. What was happening was subtle, but it was real. The story in the passenger set's minds was starting to rewrite itself. He wasn't Set the kid from the back anymore. He was the one keeping us all in peace. And Malik knew enough about people to understand that social perception is like a thermostat. Once it moves a few degrees, it rarely swings all the way back. He adjusted his posture, making himself comfortable in the first-class seat as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Not cocky, not defensive, just present. This was his silent climb. No announcement, no confrontation. Just staying in the space long enough for everyone to realize that his presence didn't disrupt their comfort, it had restored it. From a behavioral standpoint, what Malik was doing tapped into a deep psychological truth. Humans tend to assign status based on visible contribution. When someone solves a problem that affects the whole group, they're often granted an unspoken elevation, regardless of where they started. By the 1-hour mark, people weren't just tolerating Malik in first class, they were including him. A man in a polo shirt offered him a magazine. A woman leaned over to share a story about her own son. Even the flight attendant's tone softened when she checked in. Malik didn't mistake any of this for instant acceptance. He knew some of it was politeness, some of it was temporary, but he also knew that the longer he stayed, the more permanent the shift could become. Still, the climb wasn't sit without risk. Because while most passengers were adapting, one person wasn't. The businessman in the charcoal suit had been watching him closely, too closely, and the set of his jaw told Malik that he wasn't planning to let this end quietly. The baby was deep asleep now, his tiny breaths warm against Malik's shirt. The mother sat a little straighter, her composure returning, her hands resting easily in her lap. The rest of first class had settled into a calm that felt earned, like everyone knew they dodged a long, exhausting flight. Everyone except the man in the charcoal suit. He'd been watching Malik the way a security guard watches a shadow. Not out of curiosity, but suspicion, and as the seatbelt sign chimed on for descent, he finally made his move. "Excuse me," the man said loudly, cutting across the soft murmur of the cabin. "I think it's time the young man returned to his seat in economy. That step's where he belongs." The words were sharp enough to draw eyes from all around. The mother Set's head snapped toward him. "I beg your pardon?" The man gave a tight smile, as though he was doing everyone a favor. "Rules are rules. We all paid for this space. If we start letting people wander up from the back whenever they want, what sits the point?" Malik said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence can be sharper than any argument, if you hold it long enough. But the mother didn't hesitate. "They young man, just calmed my son after 2 hours of nonstop crying. None of us would have had a peaceful flight without him." "That's not the issue," the man replied, his voice louder now. "The issue is order. If we start bending it, we lose it." There it was. Not a complaint about noise, not even about Malik himself, but about the principle of who gets to be where. And that sits when the reversal began. From 2 rows up, a woman with silver hair spoke up. "Actually, I think we all benefited from his presence. If anyone belongs here today, it sets him." A man in a polo shirt chimed in next. "Yeah, he's done more for this cabin than anyone else on board. Let him be." Even the flight attendant, the same one who had tried to send him back earlier, glanced at the businessman and said quietly, "Sir, we are already on descent. He's fine where he is." It was a small chorus, but in that space, it was everything. The man in the charcoal suit stiffened, realizing that he was now the one disrupting the peace. His mouth opened as if to argue, but the weight of the stairs silenced him. Malik didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply adjusted the baby in his arms and kept his eyes down, letting the shift settle in. And here sits what that moment teaches us. True authority isn't taken by force. It's granted when people witness your value and decide you belong. By the time the wheels touched the runway, the hierarchy in first class had changed. The boy from economy wasn't visiting anymore. He was part of the space. The plane eased onto the runway, the soft thud of the landing gear announcing the end of the journey. Passengers straightened up, buckled in, glanced at their watches. The familiar rustle of travel was back, but the air in first class felt different. The baby was still asleep in Malik's arms, his small face relaxed, a faint imprint of Malik's shirt fabric on his cheek. The mother leaned in and whispered, "Thank you, I mean it, you didn't sit just help him, you helped me." Malik nodded, but didn't say much. Words felt unnecessary. When the seatbelt sign went off, the flight attendant approached, softer now than she'd been at any point earlier. "You can stay until people start disembarking," she said quietly. "That way you said not getting pushed through the crowd." It was a gesture, small but telling. Then something unexpected happened. As passengers began to stand and gather their belongings, they slowed, pausing to speak to Malik. "Thank you, young man," the woman with silver hair said, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. "You've got a gift," added the man in the polo shirt. Even the businessman in the charcoal suit muttered something, not quite an apology, but close enough that Malik accepted it with a nod. When it was finally their Rosep's turn to leave, the mother hesitated. "Would you walk with us?" she asked, "at least until we sit her out of the terminal?" Malik glanced toward economy, his seat, his own, then back to her. He shrugged lightly. "Sure." They stepped out together, the mother carrying her son now, but keeping Malik close. The flow of passengers parted without resistance, and for the first time in hours, Malik wasn't navigating the space as an outsider. At the baggage claim, the mother reached into her bag and handed him a card. "If you ever want to work with children, or if you ever just need a reference, call me, my company sits in education." Malik took the card but didn't read it right away. He slipped it into his pocket with the same quiet assurance he'd carried in first class. Because the real gift of the moment wasn't the card, or the praise, or even the new connection. It was the shift, subtle but permanent, in how people had seen him, and how he'd chosen to be seen. And that's what matters most. This wasn't redemption because Malik had been given a place in first class. It was redemption because for a brief, undeniable span of time, he owned the space with his presence, his skill, and his refusal to shrink. By the time Malik stepped out into the humid air outside the terminal, he wasn't thinking about the divide between economy and first class. He was thinking about the next time life tried to draw that line, and how ready he'd be to cross it again. In the days that followed, Malik didn't tell the story much. Not to his friends, not even to Miss Laverne, though she noticed something in the way he carried himself afterward, shoulders looser, eyes more certain. That flight could have been just another trip, an uncomfortable few hours that he would eventually forget. But it became something else. A living reminder that boundaries are often less about rules, and more about who people believe you are. And here sits the truth, Malik carried with him. You don't need permission to bring your value into the room. When you do, the room changes, even if just for a moment, and sometimes that's enough to plant seeds in the people watching. Some seeds grow slowly. Maybe one of those first-class passengers would think differently the next time they saw someone out of place. Maybe the mother would hire someone one day who didn't fit the resume mold, but who had the heart and instincts that paper can't measure. Maybe even the man in the charcoal suit would remember the quiet boy who calmed the chaos no one else could touch. And Malik? He'd keep crossing lines, not to prove himself, but to keep proving the lie wrong. The lie that says value can be priced, that worth can be bought, that belonging is something you have to ask for. She didn't know it yet, but that mother had done more than hand him a business card. She confirmed what Malik Sepp's grandmother had been telling him his whole life. "Baby, there sits no seat you can take, if you sit you're the one carrying the piece." That's what that moment teaches us. Injustice doesn't always arrive in the form of shouting or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it comes in the quiet assumption of where you should be. And sometimes, the most strategic, most revolutionary thing you can do is stay right where they didn't expect you, long enough to let your presence rewrite the rules. So the next time you feel the weight of an invisible barrier, remember Malik. Remember that the room doesn't change just because you're in it. It changes because you choose to own the space you've entered. If this story resonated with your values, I invite you to reflect on the spaces you've been told you don't belong in, and to step into at least one of them anyway. Because sometimes, a single quiet action can flip the entire outcome. Like, comment and subscribe, not for me, but so we can keep telling stories that remind us the seat is yours if you're the one carrying the piece.